I've recently done two pretty substantial jobs using foam adhesive. Skirtings, which I did a video on a couple of weeks ago, and back in February, plasterboarding the whole kitchen with this stuff. In today's video, I thought I'd pass on to you what I've learnt from using quite a lot of different adhesive foams in case you were thinking of using it on one of your projects. Because it's not the easiest way to fix plasterboard, but if you can master it, the benefits are massive when compared with drywall adhesive. But why am I suddenly now using foam when over the years I've insulated a few rooms upstairs in the cottage using drywall adhesive? Well, first up, we've got some pretty chunky time savings. Buy yourself a can of foam and an applicator gun. Non-stick is very important because this non-stick gun here has done all of those cans of foam you saw earlier on, and I still haven't cleaned it out once. And you're basically done. They reckon it saves up to 30% on time as compared with using drywall adhesive. You basically just got to shake the can, apply it, wait a few minutes and press it up to the wall, whereas with drywall adhesive you need buckets, a decent paddle mixer. You've got to endure a lot of dust and mess mixing it up, and applying it is a lot more strenuous. You'll also need a plasterer's hawk, plasterer's trowel, bucket trowel, the list goes on. And crucially, you'll have to wait twice as long to work on it. With this Sudabond, they reckon you can start plastering after an hour, compared to 2 to 3 hours setting time for drywall adhesive. And what about cost? Well, that's a substantial saving as well, because this stuff generally is about £7.75 a can. The foam spurt gun, as they like to call it, will set you back about 26 quid. And it covers 12 square meters of wall. Or perhaps not if you put on as much as you'll see I did in this video. And they say it's equivalent to a 25 kilogram bag of drywall adhesive. Whereas a 10 kilogram bag of drywall adhesive will cost you £14.99 and only cover 2.88 square meters. Next point is moisture, and if you watched a lot of my videos recently, you'll know just how obsessed I am with keeping moisture content down in the home. So you can imagine it caused me quite a lot of anxiety when I was pouring this much water into a mixing bucket to then lock all of that water behind the wall. And this is even more of an issue when you're using insulated plasterboard, which has an inbuilt vapor barrier. With this stuff, you just don't have that problem. Some of them suggest you spray the foam and or the walls to assist with the curing process, but a little bit of light spray compared to those buckets and buckets of water is a major gain. So cold, wet surfaces are also bad for insulation. And this stuff is brilliant when it comes to insulation. One of the issues with the insulated plasterboard that I installed with drywall adhesive was having to cut holes for the socket boxes. And this is a major source of cold bridging. It's basically a motorway for the moisture to flood out of your room and towards the nearest cold surface it can find, also called its dew point. And this creates what's called interstitial condensation, which is condensation forming inside your wall. Now, what I wished I'd done upstairs, it actually hasn't been too much of an issue because we keep our moisture contents down to sort of below 60% relative humidity. But if I'd used this stuff to glue my insulated plasterboard to the walls, it would have been fantastic, because what I could have done is sprayed this all around the back of the socket rather than that drywall adhesive. And I could even have sprayed it behind the metal socket box before I put the socket in, which would have pretty much eliminated any cold bridging issues because the whole area would have been insulated. It's also good for levelling uneven walls like this pier in our new kitchen that hadn't been built plumb. But to be fair, so is drywall adhesive. And actually you can correct greater irregularities with drywall. The next point to make is its real versatility in terms of the way you can combine it with multiple other fixing methods. So here I'm using it as an adhesive, but also as a final insulator on the stud-work around the reveals of the Velux window I installed in the kitchen. And I'm fixing it in place here with drywall screws because I've got adequate wood to screw into. But in other areas of the room, it made sense to install studwork to true up badly unplumbed walls, but also to make way for electrics. Here I screwed the studwork to the wall with concrete screws, but sprayed foam behind, as this made the studwork completely rock solid, particularly in areas not supported by the concrete screws with the glazing packers behind them. We've then got the insulated reveals in the kitchen with the SWIP breathable insulation I installed. Again, secured with a combination of the foam plasterboard clamps and drywall screws, combining to make the most comprehensive reveal insulation I've ever installed. There's a link on screen now. And speaking of the wall insulation, I use insulated battens, and the wall was so unplumbed in certain areas, I use an amazing amount of expanding foam adhesive to properly seal the battens against the wall before infilling with the insulation. And then there's this cavity close that my builders didn't trim properly, leaving a gap in the insulation. I actually switched back to a normal expanding foam here, but there's no reason why you couldn't just use the adhesive version to plug this cold bridging disaster area. And finally, I even used it to fix in place this LED ceiling profile with this plasterboard extension support rod to keep it in position. With all these benefits, there must be a catch, right? Well, here's me earlier to explain more. What's so different about using products like Instastick as opposed to the dot and dab adhesive is you put the dot and dab adhesive on, smack your bit of plasterboard up to the wall, give it a bit of a bash with your spirit level, and you're pretty much there. And by that I mean once you've got it where you want it, it's not going to move. Whereas with this stuff, because it's so much lighter when you put it on, you end up having to manipulate the surfaces. Got a screwdriver here to make sure you've got your levels bang on as you wait for the sort of 5 to 10 minutes, whatever it is, for this stuff to go off. I'm not saying I don't like it, my plasterer doesn't like it, but it's very different. I much prefer to have this foam inside my wall than a load of moisture from the plasterboard adhesive. But even so, it's not as easy to use. Well, that was me back then in the thick of the project, but is that right? And what can you do to make your job as easy as possible? I've used a few different adhesive foams on this job, from Everbuild's CONSTRUCTA-PRO to the perhaps market leader Instastick, through to Sudabond Easy, and I didn't even know about their dedicated plasterboard adhesive. Now, each manufacturer has slightly different suggestions as to the best way to use their product. I'll put links to these in the description below the vid. And if you're a newbie, this is a little bit confusing. But what I'll try and do now is set out a few guiding principles that apply whichever product you're using. Firstly, priming. Of these four, only Sudal talks about this and says that for chalking and the highly absorbent surfaces, you should improve adhesion with a deep solvent primer. And a bit of digging on Tinternet suggests this stuff is pretty good for where you're using polyurethane products. What did I use on this concrete block? Nothing more sophisticated, unfortunately, than a bit of watered down PVA. So I would say, if in doubt, prime your walls, as I found out last week just how important this was when an architrave failed to bond 3 times, and I can only speculate the contract emulsion wool was pulling too much water out of the product and or preventing it bonding with the wool. Water is essential for curing, but they all deal with this slightly differently, so let's look first at Everbuild's CONSTRUCTA-PRO, where they say to moisten both surfaces to be joined, but also the released foam too, to prevent undesirable foam expansion. And Sudal also talk about spraying the bead to help with curing, particularly in high temperatures and low humidity. Instastick also talk about water being important, although they go on to say that excessive moistening may negatively affect the bond strength and should be avoided. I've got to confess, I didn't moisten both surfaces here, and this is probably why I had this problem. And I ran a quick test on 2 squirts of Instastick during the skirting board video, and you can see just how much better the firmness and structure of the foam is when water is applied. So bottom line, whenever using an expanding foam adhesive, you should always lightly moisten both surfaces before pressing them together. And speaking of pressing together, there's a bit of a knack to this, which, well, I didn't exactly follow on this job. What I've learned is it's important to let the foam flash off for 3 to 6 minutes after spraying before pressing both parts together. And you know when it's ready when it goes a bit stringy to the touch. Now, they say this is to achieve optimal adhesive strength, but in my experience, the reality of this is it sort of firms the foam up a bit so that when you press the board against the wall, it pretty much stays where you wanted it to. Not as much as drywall adhesive would, but certainly more than if you put it immediately against the wall after spraying it. And this is quite an important point because Sudal again say that with their easy foam, you must not tap or remove the panels after applying, as this might reduce its strength. But they also go on to say you can readjust with a spirit level after 6 to 10 minutes. And again, I probably went in too soon with the spirit level after pressing those boards to the wall. It's always a bit confusing this because with their plasterboard product, they say you must do any realignment within the first 8 minutes. If you don't weigh it at all, as I showed in the skirting board test in my last video, this is what happens. On some of the boards I was fortunate that the sheer size of the board meant that it probably was about 4 or 5 minutes after actually applying the foam before I put it on the wall. But boards like this would have been easier and I wouldn't have had to apply this extra foam if I'd waited a bit longer. Next point to make is you do need to make sure you apply a nice thick bead, and on this piece, which was quite early on in the job, I think it's safe to say I definitely didn't, given the wall it was going on was pretty uneven. But all's not lost. If there are areas where you don't think you've applied enough and the board's not bonding properly to the wall, you can be creative and pipe more in by drilling a hole in from the front like I did here. But you've got to be careful in not pumping in too much like I did here, as when I left the wall to make a cup of tea, the foam expanded and pushed it out. So I've been dreading this bit, putting a skirting board up here to see what the wall is like. So that's the bulge, but when you compare that with the rest of the wall there, which is beautifully flat, but in actual fact could have been a lot worse, and I'll push that into the corner and just put a bit of cork down there and you won't even notice it. So it's back to that wall that needs replastering. To summarise all the key steps: moisten each surface before applying, give the foam a really good shake. This is very important to ensure the elements are properly mixed in the can, and extrude a decent sized tube onto the surface. Here I didn't like the foam structure, another mistake not purging the gun of the old foam before starting. So I start again and you can see we've got a much better foam structure from the fresh foam in the can. Get some foam gun cleaner to keep that nozzle clean, something I haven't mentioned so far. Wait 4 to 5 minutes and test the foam to make sure it's flashed off before pressing both surfaces together. Allow the foam to take hold and make minor adjustments between 6 and 10 minutes after applying. And that's it, you should have a really strong bond. So yes, it is a bit more tricky to use than drywall adhesive, but you've got none of the mixing hassle, none of those tools to buy, and it's a lot cheaper to buy and goes a lot further. And don't forget, when it comes to insulation, it knocks drywall adhesive out of the park. So all things considered, I will definitely be using the expanding foam adhesive going forward rather than the drywall adhesive for my future plasterboarding jobs. So I hope you found today's video useful. Details will, as usual, be in the description below the video of everything I've used. You can obviously access that by clicking on the More button. And if you're new to my channel, it would be amazing to have you subscribe. You can do that by clicking on the link here. And don't forget to click the bell notification icon so you get notified of all my future uploads. I've got some reclaimed doors to install now in the kitchen, so I'll see you next week.